Hello, everyone. I'm just going to go ahead and start our meeting. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. It's a great pleasure today to have Todd Rice with us and his incredible book, beautifully written book called The Showpiece City, How Architecture Made Dubai. We are going to hear about the book later and the commentary from my good colleague and friend, Pamela Karimi. Before starting the meeting, let me go over some of the logistics. Um, uh, Todd Rice would speak for around 15 minutes about the book and highlights the main points of the book and how the book came about. And then Professor Karimi would raise some questions. And again, she also would highlight some of the major contributions of the book. And then we have a short conversation after Professor Karimi's comments, after which I would open the floor, the screen, to questions from our audience members. The questions, you can submit your questions through Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. And I would read the questions and try to bundle questions in the interest of time and pose those questions to our speaker. And also before starting, I would like to, as always, thank Becky Parnian, my colleague at the center, for all her work to make these events possible. And today we also have Chris Cocker, tech support, and we had a little bit of a glitch before the meeting, and these are the moments that we really know that how important their work is. And thank you to Becky and Chris both for making this possible. Todd Rice is an architect and a writer based in Amsterdam. His work examines the global practice of architecture, especially how the architect circulates technologies and cultural narratives. He has served as Louis I. Kahn Visiting Assistant Professor in Design at the Yale School of Architecture, as well as the Rhodes Visiting Assistant Professor in Urban Studies at Yale. He has also been a guest faculty member at Harvard Graduate School of Design. He has written extensively on Arab cities in the Gulf region. His work has been featured in several outlets: Venice Architecture Biennials, the Istanbul Design Biennial, Sharjah Biennial 13, and his writings have also been published in The Guardian, Perspecta, Log, Jadiliya, Architectural Design, and Art Forum. Today, he will be discussing his book, Showpiece City, as I mentioned earlier, published by Stanford University in 2020. I just learned that his co-edited volume on building Sharjah would be released very soon in June, and that would give us another good excuse to invite him back to our series, hopefully next time in person. And one of the joys of having these events is to get together and be at each other's presence, and unfortunately the pandemic had denied that pleasure to all of us. Commenting today is Pamela Karimi, Associate Professor of Art History and Media Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth. She is an architect and an architectural historian. She earned her PhD from the History, Theory, Criticism of Art and Architecture at MIT. And since graduating, she's being one of the stars of her own field, and I got to know Pamela's work through reading her first book, Domesticity and Consumer Culture in Iran, the Interior Revolutions of the Modern Era, which came out in 2013, if I'm right. And I've always been in awe of the scope and depth of Pamela's work. She has co-edited the volume Images of the Child and Childhood in Modern Muslim Context, Reinventing the American Post-Industrial City, which came out in 2015, The Destruction of Cultural Heritage in the Middle East from Napoleon to ISIS, possibly the only place you see Napoleon and ISIS in one place. And her essays and articles have appeared in so many important publications here in the US and abroad. And with that, I stop here because I'm sure that no one here is tuning in to hear I speak, but mostly for Todd and Pamela's conversation with Todd. So here, the floor is yours, Todd Rice. I have to go back and forth between the floor and the screen. So the screen and floor are yours, Todd. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you. Just give me one moment to bring my slides up.
Okay.
I presume that's working.
It is working.
Yeah, very good. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining in today. And I'm especially thankful, Professor Gamari Tabrizi, for this invitation to be here on the floor and on the screen. And also my appreciation to the Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton for this chance to present my book to you. Thank you as well to Becky Parnian and also to Chris for that IT save just at the last minute there. I'm also looking very much forward to a discussion with Professor Pamela Karimi. And before we get to that discussion, it's my honor to go over briefly some of the themes of Showpiece City, How Architecture Made Dubai. For the sake of time, I'm going to forgo giving a play-by-play of each of the book's chapters. And in lieu of that, what I'd like to do and to use this time well is to convey, as Beirut mentioned, the motivations to write this book. And also I want to touch upon some of the urgencies that I think the book addresses. The first image I wanted to share with you today is not from the book, but it's a photograph that I took while writing it. In spring 2010, I was about 2 hours south of the Libyan city of Sabha. This man in the photograph and I were in the same store in a village. It's a village which owed its economic existence to a happenstance. And that happenstance was that it is the end of the asphalt road. This man was a member of a truck caravan that departed out of the village with jam-packed payloads beyond the asphalt road. And this payload was filled with essentials, but also modest amenities headed due south toward Niger and Chad, and also to Darfur and Sudan possibly. And these were places much further than I was headed. This man for his living steered trucks over wadi terrains and dune routes that only seasoned navigators like him could read and could survive. His was a dangerous profession because these achingly old trucks could get stuck in sand for days without anyone to come to the rescue. When we met in one of these last stores at the asphalt's end, he was loading up on mobile phone minutes, and maybe I was buying a candy bar. I can't really remember. I greeted him, and he responded in French, and I asked if I could take this photograph. My French was much worse than his, but he understood why I wanted this photo. It was this sweater. He laughed and exaggerated his pride in it to the other people in the store. Everything about Dubai, he seemed to express, is about the photogenic. I asked if he'd ever been to Dubai. No, "Have you?" he asked. I responded that I had, and he smiled as a response. I often come back to this photo because it reminds me of the limits of my own perspective toward Dubai. It also highlights and destabilizes the ways Dubai is often presented to us as brand Dubai, or as the Dubai model, or as Dubai Inc. It is often presented to us as a carefully constructed formula, a city whose legible rules promise boundless success. This man's possessing the sweater, his apparent interest and fueled imagination about the city. It reminds me that this so-called brand is beyond the control of any one person's authorship. There's no telling who reads the messages and who receives the broadcasts, the co-branding sponsorships, the ad campaigns, the VIP visa programs, and yes, all that iconic architecture. These efforts do leave a wake in global consumption streams. But it's easy to forget that Dubai means many things to many people, and any opinion that I may have about Dubai, no matter how backed up it is by so-called research, my standpoint reveals more about myself than about this city. My views of Dubai have been largely shaped by my work as an architect, and as you know, architects have been responsible for some of these broadcasts. In the early 2000s, I was working for an international architecture and urban design firm known as OMA, based here in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. The office was getting work offers in Dubai and other cities in the region. But what made my job singular is that I wasn't sent to Dubai by the office to meet and appeal to new clients. I was there to look for context, social and historical context in which the firm was being asked to work. In the early 2000s, there was little critical writing on the city to be found, at least in English. And so it was my job to piece together whatever analysis there was. And much of this work made up 2 volumes of a publication called Almanach and an exhibition at the Venice Biennial. I witnessed much of the buildup toward the 2008 to 2010 financial crisis. During that time, Dubai was also so often billed as unprecedented and unparalleled and exceptional. By 2008, I realized this was not the case. I knew there was a history that needed to be written, one about bravado, about architecture, and the professions that sell architecture. The overreach in the early 2000s was one of many boom-bust cycles in Dubai's history. So I left my job to write this book, and I wanted to write it as an architect. I am by no means the first or only architect who has spent time looking at and working in Dubai. Quite the contrary. I did find, however, that the city's history, specifically its urban history, was dreadfully lacking. For a city that is so often theorized, discussed, gossiped about, and delivered as the poster child for whatever cause, there was little historical evidence produced to back it up. At the same time, I have to convey my gratitude for much of the recent writing in the past decade, much of it being anthropological, that helped me realize and express my perspective. So I thought I'd write this book in about a year. 13 years later, I'm happy to be presenting it with you. And while I worked tirelessly to convince my editor, Kate Wall, other people at Stanford University Press, and my peer reviewers that this is indeed a scholarly work, I never let go of the fact that this is a book written by an architect. Architects need cautionary tales like this one, no doubt. And I believe this book's appeal expands to beyond just architects. In many ways, I argue that everyone can gain from learning how to read the built environment. And while today I'm not giving an overview of the city's history, the book has been written in such a way that both people who know this city well and those who do not can read about this city in a way not yet attempted. What does it mean to write a book as an architect? I'll provide some answers. For one, it means that Stanford University Press and I put a lot of care into the design and physical aspects of this book. You might say or assume that a book about Dubai will be judged by its cover. For us to achieve this quality required the support of Creative Industries Fund here in the Netherlands and also the Graham Foundation in Chicago. It also required the dedicated attention of the graphic designer Edo Smithshausen to bring life into my collection of dusty, damaged archival photographs. Legible and attractive images are important for appealing to visually oriented readers like architects. But it wasn't just that. These photographs were as essential as any other archive I had access to. And with Edo's help, it was important for me to show that these images are meant to be read. In short, this book focuses on the work of one British architect and his firm. His name was John Harris. It is important that you know upfront that this book attempts no complete history of Dubai. And in fact, I hope that in the near future, it will converse with other written histories. In many architectural histories, the arrival of the architect at the site and onto the stage, this can make for a loaded performance, a clarion moment deployed to signal that disorder will capitulate to order, to the rules of design. In this kind of telling, there is an intractable and erratic terrain before the architect arrives. But after the architect, there exists a clear and designated place for forethought and premeditation. Sometimes this has been called vision. While I work to avoid this myth-making of Harris's arrival to Dubai, it is undeniable that he and his firm did indeed contribute significantly to Dubai's growth in the 1960s and 1970s. The book features 9 projects of his firm, and these shaped Dubai, or helped shape Dubai. My review of this architecture is not, however, formal or structural or semiotic. Rather, in the end, I decided that each of these projects could function as a kind of literary tool, an analytic lens through which to explore essential aspects of how a city is transformed. It's not just that architecture is a tool for my book, but it is also revealed to be architecture is to be presented as a tool for selling and for promoting a city. In this way, the architect is more complex than some heroic arrival. He is part of a constellation of services and techniques. There is a chapter devoted, for example, to Dubai's first site of healthcare, Al Maktoum Hospital. Despite its apparent simplicity, this architecture was transformational. Al Maktoum is not just modern in appearance, but also through its creation. The project introduced some of the key ingredients to urban development for Dubai's coming decades, including the outlining, the delineating of a site, budget making, supply chain and logistical organization, professional contract making, and the presence, of course, of a traveling architect. Another chapter is devoted to the National Bank of Dubai, its headquarters, also by Harris's firm. This chapter examines how trade, and specifically the gold trade, financed a building boom that was realized around this bank building's edges on Dubai Creek. And one of the later chapters looks at Dubai's first tall tower, the World Trade Center. This chapter recounts how Harris's firm transformed the city's ambitions from meeting just basic standards to supplying business class comfort. This is all to say that Showpiece City is not a history of architecture, but a history through architecture. For many readers, this book goes far enough back to reveal a city they did not know ever existed. But I imagine, however, that there are many people here today listening who know something of this vast and long-lasting reach of Dubai's cultural, social, and economic roots, and those include Iran. And while the book is written largely from a British perspective, it is done so with the awareness that this was one among many standpoints, and for several decades, a very powerful one. As I come to a conclusion here, I'd like to say something about surfaces. On the left on this spread from the book is an early facade study for the World Trade Center tower in Dubai. And maybe you'll recognize that the facade resembles something of another World Trade Center going up at the same time, that one being in New York City. The facade is an essential element of architecture, and it is often one that is dismissed as deceptive, as a smokescreen, a display mechanism so that we don't see what's on the other side. It's often said that Dubai is superficial, that it is all about these kinds of surfaces, and that to know the city, one must look for a dark or secret side beyond the surface. In Showpiece City, I argue that we need to look at surfaces, and we need to know how to read what is presented to us. In fact, in the practice of architecture, facades are essentially the epidermis of a building. That makes them essential. No matter how elaborately gilded or minimally constrained a building's facade is, it is bound to convey a message. We architects are of a profession that builds signs against the sky. Sometimes even we don't know the language our own buildings are speaking, and that's a tragic kind of ignorance. It isn't just architects who need to become more versed, more eloquent in our vocabularies. It's easy to say that Dubai's skyline is one of rehearsed messaging, but it is up to us, including scholars, architects, and generally attentive residents of Dubai or any city for that matter. It's up to us to keep looking up at the buildings around us and also to keep an ear to the ground. In closing, I just wanted to mention some dispatches I've been giving out every month. I did these at first to let my friends and network know that the book was released, but I've decided to keep up with them through the fall as a way to touch upon a lot of the themes that, for example, I wasn't able to bring up today, but some of them I believe Pamela might be bringing up. But nevertheless, I invite you, if you're interested, to come along and read these. You can sign up to receive the next one in early May at my website. But with that, I thank you for your time today. And just one more thing, if you do read Showpiece City, I really do love to hear from people what they think about the book. So feel free to reach out. And with that, I'm very much looking forward to the conversation and comments from Pamela and also from Beirut, and perhaps from some of you.
Thank you so much, Todd. This was really a beautiful kind of vignette of what the book is all about, and the mark it leaves in the way we see Dubai, and I really appreciated that. So let me just give the floor to Pamela and see and hear what her take is after reading the book. Pamela?
Thank you. Let me start by saying how much I, as an architectural historian who's actually not very familiar with Dubai, enjoyed reading this book. Above all, I appreciated the meticulous usage of primary sources in the writing of architectural history. And I admire how diverse these primary sources are. They range from journalistic writings to financial data to correspondences between individuals, personal journals, and administrative records. And as you mentioned in the introduction to the book, most of these came from the British archives and perhaps none from Dubai. As in Dubai, apparently it's hard to access these materials. And I would appreciate it if you could elaborate further on this fact, Todd, after my presentation. You also carefully studied journalistic writings and read them against bureaucratic documents and protagonist architect John Harris's lectures and writings. You did so because you think that sometimes journalistic narratives are fictitious and that over time they become facts. Indeed, as you say, these narratives are more about how the local government and the British wanted to convey themselves than what was going on the ground. In this way, you truly help historicize the city in a genuine way, and I admire you for that. You really raise the bar for other architectural historians. This book is indeed a tour de force of archival research, and because of that, it helps dismantle the common stereotypical assumption that Dubai is a fake city, a shallow city, and that which was created overnight out of nothing. I want to take this opportunity to also compliment Stanford University Press for producing such a handsome book. The cover of the book showcases one among the several showpieces of Dubai. And these are not necessarily shiny structures of shopping malls and tourism, but hospitals, banks, and office buildings. The kind of buildings that, through their technologically advanced designs and crisp forms, express the evidence of a modern city. This one is a snapshot in the life of the World Trade Center, one building modeled after the World Trade Center in New York City, as you mentioned. And this was based on a preference by Sheikh Rashid. And I loved how you got into the details of the first model was rejected because it wasn't high enough. So this, as the story goes, this became the tallest building of the Arab world at the time until it was dwarfed by another tower. During its construction, WTC was often photographed as an obelisk amid sinuous sand dunes. Grandiosity was what the rulers of Dubai wished for, a phenomenon that continues to this day. According to a current resident who chatted with me last week, Dubai seems to be like a little boy who is in constant competition with himself, competing for getting taller and taller each and every day, and competing for constant renewal of old buildings or replacing them. To that point, another observer told me there's really no room for attachment to any space in Dubai. And as you aptly write, nearly all of Harris's works are gone now, the ones that you discuss in this book, but the street patterns of the old Dubai still follow Harris's design, and that's why this book is so important. In terms of facilities, this building, the World Trade Center, was all in all. It had everything, especially well-equipped by technology that would tame the environment. The tower itself was fully air-conditioned thanks to 7 kilometers of concealed coils. So as you write, AC was hidden from plain sight. Likewise, in another chapter of the book, you show that the Brise Soleil in the National Bank of Dubai helped conceal the clutter of air conditioning units. Starting in the 1930s, perhaps with the work of Le Corbusier, modern architecture in the global south is filled with examples of the history of shading devices, from Brise Soleils to louvers, screens, jalousies, and other attempts to control the way that the sun entered a building. Here, it seems like these techniques are indeed incorporated, however, mostly superficially rather than in an effort to reduce carbon footprint. I love these moments in your text because they tell us so much about the politics of environmental design. As we all know, the struggle for survival in the desert, which demanded limited sustainable design forms and constant seasonal migration, gave colonial and pseudo-colonial powers a ploy to often justify their occupation of the region in ecological terms. So the American technical assistance programs, for example, came to fix water irrigation systems by building dams, and they fought for survival in the desert through petroleum-dependent devices. In another place, you describe the Sheikh Rashid Hospital as a city within a city. It turns inward with few openings and windows. Thus, as you aptly write on page 220 of the book, this is an expression of an air-conditioned interiority that emerges perhaps for the first time in Dubai and continues to be the case for many decades to come. Going back to the picture again, we see that the facade has two layers. It is a building within a building, as John Harris described it. Interestingly, the space between the two facades was just enough for very thin men to clean windows and perform maintenance. Here, two men are shown fastened to the building by wire, and we see how the so-called thin bodies fit within the two facades. So the building itself is an embodiment of exploitation of non-Western labor. Then you go on to show in other parts of the book how South Asian workers were deleted from records and construction narrative to describe these projects as truly British built. So this story strikes a chord with American/British built oil company towns around the regions, and I'm sure many scholars are familiar with that here. Thus, you beautifully describe how, as much as these buildings were materialization of Dubai's economic freedom, they were also sites of bounded control. Now, let me discuss another aspect of the book which I really admired, and that's the notion of representation of architecture through film and photography. This photo is taken from what Jonathan Rabin, famous journalist who wrote in his 1974 book, Soft City, and you quote him in the book, calls Hawk's Eye View, a trope that is also present in the ways in which oil cities of the Middle East were first photographed or featured in documentary films by British and other European powers. La Via del Petrolio, a film made by Bernardo Bertolucci in 1962, comes to mind. You look at a couple of documentary films here in which we encountered disembodied perspectives and other tropes rooted perhaps in old Orientalist models of representation. So we have aerial views, timelessness, disengagement with local people, by, for instance, blaring peoples of different national origins, as you write so beautifully. And of course, a focus on progress rather than showcasing the problems. Despite all of these, you also explain that some of these quote unquote propaganda films failed. On the same topic, let me commend you for creating a very nuanced text by preventing the black and white dichotomies. Despite all these colonial tropes you discuss in the book, there are so many episodes where you make references to cases in which British administrators warned against colonial models that were in vogue in former oil cities. As well, you also talk a lot about the push from the local elites, particularly Sheikh Rashid. Also, there are episodes of real environmental concerns. For example, Harris himself was against all glass buildings. In fact, this modular unit with traditional Arab arches was not made with a nostalgic or romantic frame of mind, but to carefully reduce the effects of glazing. In some ways, I think here too, we have a slightly different historicization of the patterns of segmented labor, you know, the famous high-paid Europeans versus those trapped in a system of work sponsorship known as kafala. You describe how the people who were called undesirables always existed in the region, even before the British showed up. And these were mostly the people who, on their way back from Hajj to their homelands, decided to stay in Dubai in search of work. So in a way, they were always part of the economic landscape of this place. Now, I want to ask a couple of questions that I feel were not addressed abundantly, but perhaps it's largely due to the word limit determined by the press. So this question that I have, my first question, is about how you contextualize Dubai within a global and regional context. And you do a beautiful job at that. For example, you talk about the mistakes and the successful moments in the building of Singapore, Hong Kong, and Sudan that the British explored in order to avoid them or replicate them. You also talk about how the other 6 emirates of the UAE affected development in Dubai. What I wanted to know more was in what ways major events in the region affected the economic situation in Dubai, and as a result, the building processes. For example, Beirut, as we know, went overnight from being the quote unquote the Paris of the Middle East to a war zone. To what extent did that war affect developments in Dubai? the Shah of Iran turned the Kish Island in south of Iran into a tourist destination in the 1970s, complete with a casino and a lot of other accommodations. How did it affect Dubai? And also, what about the Islamic Revolution of 1979? Lastly, there are two questions about methodology. Throughout the book, we are primarily left with a story of Dubai that foregrounds the British and the royal family, perhaps at the expense of social life of ordinary people on the ground. Is this a methodological preference rooting in the fact that historical research is fundamentally different from ethnography, or is something else implied? And finally, a question about the use of secondary sources. Throughout the text, you reference a lot of important authors. The work of Ahmad Khanna and Stephen Ramis comes to mind. But you do not necessarily engage with them extensively. And I wanted to ask you to reflect on that if you can. I want to turn the platform now back to you, but before I do so, I just want to take this opportunity to congratulate you again for this book. This book not only tells us a lot about Dubai, but it's also a model for other architectural historians in terms of the usage of primary sources. And I really, really enjoyed reading it. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Pamela. This was such an interesting and comprehensive reading of the book. I'm sure, Todd, you have some thoughts on these comments. Why don't we hear from you, and then I'll open the floor up for questions from members of the audience. And I do have some questions of my own, but I can talk to you about it later. I'm more curious to hear about you and from you and from the audience. But go ahead, Todd.
Okay, thank you, Pamela. This is really very nice. I'm quite emotional just hearing someone kind of really who's so taken the time to get through the material in such a kind of thorough way and to come to give it kind of a critical look. It really means a lot to me, especially during these pandemic times. I just haven't been able to engage with a lot of people, and so that also kind of heightens this kind of emotional reaction I have to it. I have to share. So thank you for that. I could just go right into the questions, maybe the critical aspects that Pamela brought up. The first was contextualizing Dubai in a more of a global or a larger regional context. Actually, all three of these, Pamela is shooting the arrow into the three Achilles heels of the book. And in this one, I did try, especially looking at, not so much, I think there was an interest, especially from outside reviewers and from people who were helping me, especially to put this in a larger context of like Hong Kong and Singapore that also have their roots in a kind of British colonial pursuit that was kind of highly based on trade and the fantasy of a tax-free life. It just became too much in terms of trying to get it in there, not per se because of word count, but just kind of keeping a story that one could go with. In terms of the kind of regional, where it was fitting into these regional topics, there was one that I brought up, which was the revolution in Iraq, where there was this kind of moment when Iraq could have been supplying a kind of British-trained Iraqi professional force to help instill a municipality. There was I believe he was called a municipal consultant, who is actually one of the first consultants is this kind of municipal expert coming in from Iraq. But the kind of the breakdown of the relationship between Great Britain and Iraq makes this kind of idea one that can't happen. yes, the notion of the revolution in Iran doesn't play much of a role in the book. I can't further kind of touch upon that. The only thing that I would say is what I felt that I really needed to get, based upon after taking the time to get through a lot of the primary sources, was that I wanted to get these kind of maybe less noticeable influences out there that wouldn't have gotten the attention as quickly. For example, as you mentioned, Pamela, the connection to Sudan, so that instead of the municipal export coming from Iraq, they're coming from Sudanese men who have been trained by departed British colonial officers who then are in Dubai. And I felt like those were the stories that really needed to come forward, because they were the ones really kind of affecting and influencing the kind of day-to-day running of the city, and also the kind of slow process of transforming the city. That also includes influences of what was going on in Kuwait, for example. Just the image. I mean, one thing that's I think a curiosity is just the idea of a revolving door in a bank becomes something that Kuwait has one, and it. I mean, we talk about Gulf cities mimicking each other all the time, and I don't mean to say that this is the start of that, but there is this kind of looking toward what other cities have done who have benefited from petroleum wealth. And not that Dubai's was ever so much as Kuwait or Doha's, but that there was the expectation that it would be that way. Another aspect that Pamela brought up was methodology. Oh yes, right. About the fact that the focus is much more on the local elites and the British. I think one main reason about this has to do with yes, true, it's not an ethnography, and I think one way that I was trying to use the fact that simply there were certain kinds of material that were available to me and others that were not. And so what I did was, I've made an effort to explain that, I've written this book as an architect, and an architect is one of these expert elites who is involved in this program. And that was a way for me to kind of reformulate the architect. The architect is so often presented in another kind of way in architectural history, not all the time, but I wanted to prevent the idea that the architect is not part of this kind of vaster constellation, really, of expertise that's going on. That being said, I don't want to suggest that this is exactly the book that I wanted. If there had been more access to materials, I would have done, and I did look. Not everything is British in the book. There are aspects from Dubai that I was able to access. Those included kind of Dubai municipality's own production of promotional materials about itself. Of course, these aren't, these are promotional, just as any advertisement in the Financial Times or London Times. But nevertheless, they were probably also created with British experts and Sudanese experts contributing to them. But nevertheless, they came with the stamp of the Dubai municipality. Also, one of the Sudanese experts, Kamal Hamza, was the chief editor of Dubai's first magazine, Akhbar Dubai, which is a source throughout the book. Issues of the magazine that I was able to find. But again, this is a state-issued magazine, not the most objective journalism that one could have. I did look for public archives in Dubai. I finally found a building in Dera, maybe kind of 2 blocks away from the municipal government, and they were surprised that I showed up and quickly informed me that the archives start in 1984 or something like that, kind of a strange date. But nevertheless, it has been an ongoing frustration for other people who've tried to write about Dubai. But there are people who have recently been able to get access to things. I simply didn't have access. And then secondary sources. Yes, I haven't, I think the one that I most engaged with is Stephen Ramos's book, mostly because that was the one mostly focused on history. So Ahmed Khanna, he says up front, I'm not writing you a history. Nevertheless, Ahmed's book was a big help for me at the very beginning of my project, almost as a way to kind of set up, the place where I started from, kind of helping me to see where I was going, literally going back in time. That's really one of the, and also it's just, there was so much primary material, primary sources that hadn't been used to describe the city's history that I wanted to focus on that.
That's fantastic. You mentioned going back in time, and I have to share this story that I think it was early 2000s. I was in Dubai, and there was a little sandstorm, and then I saw all these like hundreds of people sweeping the sidewalks from the sand, and I thought that this is such a fascinating scene that to be in Dubai and they're sweeping sand from the sidewalk, and I mean the image that came to mind at the time was like a scene from a Tarkovsky movie, that it just basically crushes your sense of temporality, that the relationship that they're building. And I think sand is such a key kind of element in this building, this kind of temporality in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and the Gulf cities, that it's kind of very fascinating, uncomfortable, claiming, disclaiming, reclaiming the past through these perceptions of sand. I love that photo of the Trade Center that you have in the book, that there's this high rise in the middle of these sand dunes, and in a sense, and the caption reads something like the Trade Center in the middle of nothing, And I thought that this is just such a fascinating kind of way that I encountered this notion in Dubai, and both Dubai and Abu Dhabi, that how they think and rethink their relationship with their own past. I know that Pamela mentioned that this idea of fake cities and made up cities, but there is a concerted effort to redefine and rearticulate the relationship of the city with its own past, and sand becomes such a again key element in defining that form of temporality. And in a sense, your book is so fascinating because in a way it's the prehistory of the history of the city, and this is the time that not that many people pay attention to. I mean, that history, like the archive center there, starting from 1984, that's the history that is highlighted. All these experimental sort of architecture, building architectural sort of gems there that I thought that it'd be very, very interesting. I mean, again, I mean, that was a comment that came to mind that you, especially when you're thinking about representations through photography and film. I thought that, in so many different ways, Tarkovsky is sort of an interesting sort of representation of this compression of time in this context. There is a question there that, I mean, you can also, continue that conversation, but there's a question on the floor about this new Museum of the Future, that in a sense, possibly can we read that as a way of erasure of labor altogether in building, because the claim is that this is built by artificial intelligence and robots and this and that. Do you see that as a way of kind of erasing labor history from from the narrative of construction of the city. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yes. I mean, a quick answer is yes. I think that's the case. I mean, for example, just this week, Dubai officials announced what's billed as the first agreement for a driverless fleet of taxis. So again, one of the most obvious ways to see labor in the city of Dubai is through the use of taxis, the chauffeurs as a presence in the city. Yes, that's for sure the case, and it's an interesting thing though. But it's not always been that way. There is evidence, beginning in the 70s and into the 80s, that Dubai officials were trying to pitch the city as a place of cheap labor. That, if you based your business, for example, in Port Jebel Ali, that you would then have access to a cheap labor force. By the 90s, that's when they begin to edit this campaign, and you see a kind of major campaign to literally make people leave the city who were there. First, the people who were there without proper documentation, proper work visas, and suddenly, like this kind of labor force that was being promoted was now no longer being promoted, and that's in the 90s. And I think we've just gradually seen that be the case as we move forward. But yes, this kind of even Gökçe Gönül, who wrote about Masdar. Masdar too was supposed to be this place of sustainability. It's now becoming an institute of artificial intelligence. Once again, kind of a further erasure of a particular income level of people in Masdar is in Abu Dhabi, but nearby.
Yeah, that's so amazing. The other question we have from the floor is: are there other Harris buildings that you wanted to write about and you didn't, or it doesn't appear in the book? And if you wish to talk about those cases.
Yes, and there are more buildings and projects that the office had. I think one which is featured in the book. In fact, I showed a small photograph of it, but I wasn't able to go into it very much. Was so after the firm designed the National Bank of Dubai, the main headquarters in Dera. Several years later, there was a commission to build a small branch of it on the other side in Dubai, near the Abra station there. I believe, it was the original location of this bank, this kind of government founded bank. And I would have liked to spend more time on it. I would have liked to find more, I guess, evidence of how it was designed and why it was designed. It was kind of purposely kept at a very tight, small scale that really did a very good job at responding to the context of buildings in Dubai at the time. That's my quickest answer. Yeah, for sure.
I see the sort of interesting encounter in Dubai that you have this sense of how British everything remains there, despite the fact this kind of very strong financial, political connections with the US. But is this again, for me, it was a very kind of superficial encounter there. But my impression was that British connection at the managerial level, at the sort of design and thinking level of urban planning, still persists. Is this true, or that was just a superficial reading on my part?
I think it's very much still there is a British presence. I don't know any of the numbers of how many British residents are in Dubai versus, say, New Zealanders or South Africans or Australians, Canadians. Yeah, obviously, English is the lingua franca of the city, but that's not just because of a British presence, of course. I think even though already in the 1970s, with the production of the World Trade Center, which was being promoted by, several hundred British consultants who had worked on this as a British tower. One of the main contractor describes the Trade Center as a British site, as if, you want to assure, potential investors, potential residents, leaseholders, that if you're arriving on the Trade Center, it's as if you've come into, British town, fill in the blank. At the same time, you also see this kind of fear that this hold of a potential niche market is at risk. That other, with 1970, with 1971, when the British political presence, as it's called, it leaves, there's increasingly more competition available, not available, but present in Dubai to compete for these projects, and not just other English-speaking countries, but elsewhere, India, Egypt, Lebanon, much more of a competition from these, from expertise from these countries, for sure.
Very, very good. Let me see if Pamela has a final word, because we are reaching the end of our conversation. Pamela, would you like to say some concluding remarks?
Well, no, I think that Todd very convincingly responded to all of my questions. And thank you so much also, Berus, for inviting me to this very, very informative panel. I really enjoyed reading this book, Todd, and I appreciated it because of certain topics that are very, very important today in terms of the architectural history of the Middle East, and that's the relationship between climate and architecture. And you look at these archives, these primary sources, to tell us the true story, as opposed to whatever is in the air and everybody talks about it. But you give us all of those details, and I think that's a very, very important thing to have. So this book is highly recommended.
Thank you so much. Again, thank you, Todd and Pamela, for this wonderful conversation. And I highlight that this is a book that if you're interested in learning about architecture and history and the region, I love the way Todd conceptualized the book, History Through Architecture. And it's not necessarily an architectural history, it's just a history through architecture, and it's a beautifully produced book. And again, thank you so much. And sorry if we didn't get to respond to your questions. You can contact Todd for your questions, and we need to stop here. So thank you so much. Next time in person for both of you, Pamela and
sure,
Todd.
yes. Yeah. And thank you to both of you. This is a really heartwarming experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye now.